I just felt very powerless.
Yeah.
And like, what is the point? I was about to be out of contract. I didn't have a great sales record behind me. Was this the end?
Hello and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Jonathan Tulloch and I'm really pleased to be talking to Holly Race. Hello, Holly.
Hi, Jonathan.
How are you doing?
Not too bad, thank you.
Good. I'd like to start with, in this segment, we often talk about a newsworthy event in the writing world. And World Book Day is always every day for us is obviously World Book Day. And I was interested reading about how you got involved. Do I pronounce it Pixel?
Yes.
Yeah, can you tell us a bit about that?
It's a really wonderful charity that supports schools with all kinds of sort of educational needs, but I was involved in the literacy part, and it was really about trying to instill a love of reading and words in young people, mainly teenagers. And I think it's so needed because, you know, the curriculums these days are they're like little straitjackets. And it's really hard to foster love of stories in that straitjacket. So Pixel was all about talking to young people about the wonders of reading, about ways that you can access stories if you find reading really difficult, which is a subject very close to my heart because my father is very dyslexic, and also sort of giving recommendations for books around a particular theme.
Excellent. So how would you choose a book for a teenager? I mean...
Good question. I don't necessarily always go by what you find on the young adult shelves at Waterstones, because I don't believe that we should really be restricting what young people read, to be honest. I was reading adult novels at 9, 10, and I didn't understand them at all, but I loved the words. So I sort of look at what inspires me and what I'm hearing a lot of young people talking about on things like TikTok, for example, which I know a lot of people are like, but it can be useful to see what's really picking up steam. And then I look at those and I try to find slightly adjacent titles, so maybe titles that haven't had the big marketing boost that others have, but that are in a similar vein.
When you were a teenager, you said that you often read adult books, but was there any sort of young person's books or something that you remember as a child?
This is going to be very populist, but Philip Pullman. My mum was a book editor at a magazine at the time, and she brought home a first edition, first impression copy of Northern Lights because she had heard great things about it on the grapevine. So it was before it really picked up steam, became so well known, but I just whizzed through that, and then I couldn't afford to buy the sequels, so I would go to Waterstones and very cheekily sort of sit on a sofa and read them after school.
Good idea. Do you think that books for teenagers and young readers have changed a lot, say, in the past decade?
Yes. I think they've become what I would think of as more adult. I think that at the time that Northern Lights was published, I feel as though it was very marketed towards teenagers. And actually, that's a huge age range. It's a very big difference between 11 and 18, right? And I think publishers have definitely become more wise to that. They sort of think about teens versus YA versus crossover, which is sort of that what used to be called new adult, which sort of went out of flavour and then is slightly coming back in again now, but under the name crossover. So yes, I think a lot of those books have become more adult. It's very rare to find a YA book that doesn't have a strong romance element in it, I would say.
Interesting, yeah. We have on the podcast, we have an archival slot, which I find absolutely fascinating. It's when we look into the huge bank of recordings of writers talking about the writing life. This has been going on for 10 years, so it's a really good resource. And I find it fascinating because it gives us a really good idea of the writing life rather than just something that is sanitized for the media or sold in terms of like cash, how much they've made. And so we're going to have a look and a listen to Bathsheba Fraser, who is talking about her formative reading.
I was 11 years old when my parents gave me Pearl S. Buck's novel, The Good Earth, for my birthday. The very first line, "It was Wang Lang's wedding day," caught my attention. Today, as a writer, I know that it is one of the most captivating opening lines in literature. I was not old enough to understand the full implications of a marriage then. But weddings certainly, with their glamour and excitement, were hugely attractive. But why would a Chinese peasant's marriage to a slave in a world I didn't know, at a time which was way in the past for me, prove so compelling? Once I had started, I found the book unputdownable. I wanted to know about Olan's life the moment I met her. Her unattractive, expressionless face, her plodding walk, her lack of words did not put me off. I trusted Olan. I wanted to know how Wang Lang and she got on in life. I was glued. The book was to change my life in unprecedented ways. My grandparents and parents' generation were avid readers of Bach. I went on to read the rest of her trilogy, Sons and A House Divided, and her novels like Dragon's Seed, Peony, East Wind, West Wind, Mandala, The Townsman, and The Living Reed, and I loved her biographies of her mother and father, The Exile and Fighting Angel, respectively. Pearl S. Buck won the Nobel Prize in 1938, and most importantly for me, she had come to India, where a friend of my father's had met her, and was deeply struck by her graciousness and humanity. What attracted me to her was her East-West affiliation, as she became the leading spokesperson for Asia to America, writing persuasively for an understanding of China, Korea, India, and Japan. But the tide turned against her after the Nobel Award. Since Buck had spent the first 18 years of her life in China, married an agricultural advisor and academic, John Buck, who taught at Nanking University, and went back to live and write in China, and because she initially wrote about China and the East, she was not considered a purely American writer in her own country, even when she returned to live there permanently. And in China, because her books portrayed a world before the Communist Revolution, she was rejected for her lack of engagement with a modern China. Pearl S. Buck could not be slotted. The whole idea of a writer capable of having two worlds, as the title of her biography, My Several Worlds, establishes, had not caught on. My own poetry captured my two worlds, of Britain and India, as I had started writing in London as a child and could move easily between my two worlds in my imagination. I went on to do honours and a master's degree in English literature, but when the time came to choose a PhD topic, I decided to work on Pearl S. Buck, a minor writer by then and almost forgotten. I decided to place her in a global literary network, exploring the saga elements in her fiction, slotting her back into the Anglo-American English canon, and establishing the links between her work and Scandinavian and Chinese saga, maintaining and celebrating her East-West affiliations. And Hilary Sperling's excellent biography of Buck, Bearing the Bones, has once again endorsed this cultural ambassador and writer for me, whose task was to bring the East and West closer through mutual respect and understanding, which is a role I continue to value as a writer.
Let's hear it for minor writers.
Absolutely.
Had you heard of Pearl S. Buck?
I hadn't, but I really want to go and read The Good Earth now.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I've got a faint memory of seeing this old faded book in a library in the 70s sometimes. But well done, Bathsheba, you've sold it to us.
Absolutely.
I enjoyed the idea of two worlds that Bathsheba was talking about. Do you have two worlds that you feel as if you have to sort of like bring together?
I think I found that extract so interesting because you wouldn't know it to look at me. I'm very stereotypically white British, but my mother is half Chinese. And so my maternal grandmother was Chinese. And I think there's been a lot of identity crisis in our family as a result of that, actually. So I really related. And I think having two worlds as a writer is actually a really good, helpful place to be in, because nationalism or evangelicalism of any kind is anathema to good writing.
So you like being on the seesaw between sort of definites?
Yes, I think you need to be able to exist on two planes. As a writer, you have to be objective to an extent, but you also, when you're writing, you have to be incredibly subjective. And so it's a very strange state of being, I think, being a writer, that you have to hold these contrasts in your head all the time. And I think that goes through to identity, to worlds, to, yes, the act of writing itself.
That's really well put. How do you feel sort of like the Chinese and the British element in you? I mean, do you feel they have voices contending that they want to come out when you're writing?
For me personally, I don't necessarily feel as though I can claim my Chinese heritage, but I do feel it in a certain emotional distance from my British identity, I suppose. It makes me quite... I mean, I think we're all quite critical of Britain recently, but yeah, I think I hold Britain and the UK at arm's length a lot because of that, and sort of out of loyalty to my grandmother.
Did you meet her?
Yes, she died when I was, I think, 13 or 14. But yes, I adored her, but she had a lot of, I've come to realise and understand through my mum and my uncle that she had a lot of flaws that I didn't necessarily see at that age.
Yes.
And I think as a result of the fact that she left Hong Kong and moved to Britain, and she was Macanese, so she also felt as though she had a strong connection to Portugal and a lot of internalized racism, I suppose, about her identity, which is tragic, really. Yeah.
So, I mean, is this a conscious thing for you? I mean, it's obviously your life. So when you sit down to write, maybe, I don't know, is it something that's...
It was in my most recent book, my adult Tudor fantasy. Some of my characters have a little of that flavour in them. I don't think that part of my identity is directly inspired, but it is definitely seasoned, I suppose.
Bathsheba says at the end, she talks about the role that she continues to value as a writer. I love the idea of writers re-examining what we do, you know. And what do you value as a writer? What your role as a writer? What's the thing you value?
I think the digging down into essentials and finding different ways of putting them on paper has become more and more valuable to me, especially, I think, as a fantasy author, because people assume it's always dragons and orcs and things like that, whereas actually most fantasy and sci-fi, I think, are metaphors for present-day problems and issues and feelings that we are experiencing as a society. And so to try and articulate that within a fantasy setting, that's really valuable to me. That's
what I found really interesting when I was looking at what you'd done, because I'm a recent convert to reading fantasy and sci-fi. And could you call it speculative fiction? Is that?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because it does come with a stereotype, doesn't it?
Yes, I think there are certainly sci-fi and fantasy, less so speculative, I would say, but sci-fi, fantasy, horror, which are sometimes sort of lumped in together, people have a certain view of it.
So just for the geek in me, what is speculative? How would we define speculative fiction?
It's what... Because I used to work in the TV world, we would call it high concept. So it's, I would say it is real world, grounded in the real world to an extent, but with one important difference, which is your hook. So it is the real world, but men don't exist, or the real world, but half the population has been, vanished or moved to a different island or something like that. Something like Naomi Alderman's The Power, I suppose, would be speculative, wouldn't it?
Yes, yeah. So you were saying there about you worked in, was it film? Film
and TV, yes.
Yeah. What was that? Could you tell us what you did there?
I started out as a script reader, which means that very much how it sounds. I read a lot of script. I also got sent a lot of books before they were published, and I had to read them very quickly and write reports on them on whether I thought they were suitable for adaptation for whichever production company I was working for.
So you've worked on the dark side as well.
I have indeed. So whenever anyone's like, oh, the book was better, I was like, but there's a reason they made those changes. It wouldn't have worked on screen if they had been faithful. Not always, but a lot of the time I can absolutely see why they've had to make changes to the book to make it work on screen, which is a very different medium. So yes, I started out as a script reader, and then I worked my way up to becoming a script editor and a development executive, which means I was finding ideas, I was finding books for adaptation and working with the script writers to improve their work.
You say that you've got a particular interest in using fantasy and historical inspiration as springboards to interrogate issues of class, privilege, gender bias and political extremism. That's great. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Very high and lofty words from me. I don't know if I can follow them up.
Interesting, though.
It's what I would like to be doing. My latest book, it's a trilogy, and it's a feminist fantasy reimagining of the 6 Wives of Henry VIII. So a lot of the things that my 6 queens are going through
that's good.
Are things that I think a lot of people can relate to in this day and age, sort of emotional abuse, the fine line between consent and non-consent, and women's reproductive rights. All of those things come into my novel, but I hope that because it's within a fantasy setting, it doesn't feel quite as grim and as like on the nose as it might otherwise be.
Yes, yeah, because I mean we have to discuss the stereotype of the old school stereotype of wizards and witches and quite sexist as well in some respects.
Yes, I think a lot of older fantasy is very male, very masculine,
yes, yeah.
And I love it. Like I loved The Lord of the Rings as a child, but there's been a real surge of female-focused fantasies lately. Things like Tasha Suri's The Jasmine Throne, which is just this incredible feminist, sapphic, epic fantasy inspired by Indian folklore and mythology. And, I mean, that's just one of many. So I'm sort of hoping to join those ranks.
Well, it sounds like you will, because the depth of what you're talking about, like we think about King Arthur, right? How do you begin to link him with the culture wars?
So that was my YA fantasy trilogy, which is an urban fantasy, and it's sort of set between this world London, and sort of dreamscape London. And
Dreamscape London, what's that?
So sort of the place that we go to when we sleep, it becomes like an alternate world. So my main character would go into a sort of dream version of the world, and she lives in London, so she would be in like a London figured with unicorns and nightmares and monsters in the Thames and things like that. But I was writing it during Brexit, and I was really taken aback by the populism, by the way that people would put human beings, fallible human beings, on pedestals, and then they could do no wrong. And that really scares me when people do that to anyone, be it a pop star or a politician, because our dreams really linked into our subconscious. I wanted to kind of create a dream world where some people could manipulate your dreams in order to instigate populism, nationalism, extremism. and how might you do that through people's subconscious.
That's great.
And you asked about King Arthur.
Yeah.
The Arthurian side of that came in because I used to love The Sword and the Stone by T.H. White, but Arthur, again, he's sort of become a little bit of an icon of Britain, and so I kind of wanted to topple him off that pedestal during the trilogy.
Are you a professional writer struggling with financial difficulties? The Royal Literary Fund is here to support you. At the RLF, we believe that every writer deserves the chance to thrive, no matter what life throws your way. We offer a variety of hardship grants tailored to help professional writers in need, whether it's short-term relief or ongoing support. Perhaps you're dealing with an unexpected expense, a drop in income, or facing challenges that make writing difficult, such as illness, disability, or now relying on your pension. If you're eligible, our grants team will walk you through our discreet and confidential application process, ensuring you receive the support you need. Visit rlf.org.uk to check your eligibility and inquire today. The Royal Literary Fund. We believe writers matter because writing matters.
We have another archival slot, which we're just dipping into this lovely hoard, treasury really, of unused, repackaged recordings. And this is, we're going to listen to a writer called Mene van Praag.
Yes, she's a friend of mine.
Good. We didn't know that, but that's lovely. Yeah, you're both based in Cambridge.
We are.
Excellent. So we'll have a little listen to this.
I'm currently living on the same street as the one I lived on throughout my childhood. Between the ages of 0 to 18, I lived in 6 houses on that street, and now I'm back. After my parents separated, they left our family home to move a few metres down into houses that stood directly across the street, so that my brother and I could wave at each other from their front windows if we so chose. In the years that followed, my parents followed each other along the street, one of the longest in Cambridge, so we never had far to walk between them. It was a strange setup, perhaps, but I appreciated it. However, all the moving as a child didn't foster in me an adventurous spirit, quite the opposite, in fact. My brother became the adventurer, travelling all over the world, never happier than when exploring a new, exotic location. I, on the other hand, became rather Hobbitian in my approach to adventure, the biggest move in my life being to decamp from Cambridge to Oxford for 5 years to attend university. Although I began writing while at Oxford, all my published novels are set in Cambridge, and their setting has always played as important a part in the stories as the protagonists and their plots. I adore Cambridge, its history, its architecture, its nooks and crannies, its secret little streets. It is a character as enchanting and intriguing as any I'll ever create. And I cherish the opportunity to sit in its parks, museums, botanical gardens and cafes to write. Of course, I have my favourite places. Fitzbilly's on Trumpington Street, overlooking the Pitt Building in Pembroke College, has featured in a good number of my novels, its famously delicious and decadent Chelsea buns fueling hundreds of hours scribbling over the years. Another favourite destination is Jack's Gelato, an ice cream emporium owned by my very own brother, who generously permits me to sit for hours in a comfy nook and write while consuming more quantities of his stock than is good for either of us. But the sites that inspire me more consistently than any other is a rather more insalubrious and unassuming space than the chic cafes and ancient, illustrious buildings. It is the cemetery on Mill Road. Now, of course, there's nothing special in that. Writers have long been inspired by graveyards, especially those writers of a more Gothic bent. We have the so-called graveyard poets, the most famous being William Cowper, along with Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Graveyard and Robert Blair's The Grave. Famous novels centering on cemeteries include Stephen King's Pet Sematary, the recent Booker Prize-winning Lincoln in the Bardo by George Sanders, and my own personal favourite, Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. Another favourite author of mine, Audrey Niffinger, took a job as a tour guide at Highgate Cemetery to research the novel Her Fearful Symmetry, her follow-up to The Time Traveller's Wife. Tracy Chevalier followed her bestseller, Girl with a Pearl Earring, with a novel inspired by cemeteries, Falling Angels, a story inspired in large part by the Victorian obsession with graveyards. My own favourite cemetery isn't a grand affair. It doesn't contain the graves of brilliant and influential cultural figures, nor is it especially picturesque or well-maintained. Yet, for me at least, that is the very reason for its charm. I love how its long grasses are allowed to grow unchecked, the ivy permitted to creep across the gravestones until some are altogether obscured, the trees reaching their branches over the paths to create tunnels of foliage, clouded overhead by blossom in the spring and scattered underfoot with crunching leaves in the autumn, only bare and bereft for the few months of winter. I love that my cemetery, as I possessively think of it, is a place to wander away from the everyday world, to step into a place largely absent of people, at least those who are living, and so beyond the rational and the ordinary. I always find that places in which nature is allowed, in the words of Daphne du Maurier, to come into her own again, are particularly conducive to igniting the imagination. Buildings, no matter how ancient and ornate, still ring with the echoes of the men who built them, and even the manicured gardens, while often beautiful, are marked by similar associations. It's those places which have a certain element of wildness that more readily coax the human mind to step outside the lines of its limitations and run as wild and free as the nature surrounding it.
What a lovely essay about place, and it really took me to Cambridge, which is obviously it's where you're from as well. Have you been to the cemetery there?
I have, yes. I've been there quite a few times, especially during lockdown when we were only allowed our one hour out at a time. It was a beautiful little haven. It's got a little fig tree in one corner and a little kind of open spot in the centre where you can sit on a bench and have a little picnic. There's always dogs being walked there, people cycling through it to get from one side of Cambridge to the other. It's a wonderful, very magical place. I can see why Menna has honed in on that.
Yeah. Where in Cambridge do you go to time and time again? What draws you?
I think for me, it's the little known back alleys and the buildings that have a lot of magic and appeal to me. There's some beautiful Georgian buildings in Cambridge, which is mostly Victorian. But yes, those Georgian buildings, one of which I'm lucky enough to live in now, are just so special. And there's a place called Maid's Causeway, which is in the north of the city, which is lined with Georgian houses. And then it's got what's known as Midsummer Common behind it, which leads down to the river and has cows grazing on it. And then you can actually follow the river all the way without having to step foot on a proper road or see a car, all the way through to Coldham's Common and then through there up towards the Fens. And it's a really magical kind of bike ride or walk.
Yeah, I mean, my son went to Cambridge, so we visited, and I think back on it, what a gracious, beautiful place. There's that bit in Thomas Hardy, the Mayor of Casterbridge, where a butterfly starts at one part of the town and flutters down the main street, then it's gone. That's how I imagine Cambridge. It's just so connected. So Cambridge obviously is in your heart. Does it figure in your writing at all?
Not as much as I would like. I actually think Cambridge is quite a tricky city. I say city because that's technically what it is. It's really a market town. It's quite a tricky place to write about, I think. Menna manages it beautifully in her books because tonally her books fit Cambridge. You can tell that Cambridge is absolutely in her blood. Whereas for me, I think some elements of the Cambridge architecture come into some of my settings, and I've managed to make it a brief sort of 2-chapter setting in the second book in my YA trilogy. But really, I think it's quite difficult to write about it in a non-rose tinty way, or not a way that isn't very cozy, which isn't the kind of thing that I write.
I remember hearing something that the Fens have a huge influence on Cambridge. Like, say, for instance, if you have Oxford and Cambridge, Oxford's quite warm because of the Cotswolds, and Cambridge is cold because of the air rising almost like a ghost from the Fens.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't realised that, but it makes a lot of sense. Yes, there's a lot of misty mornings, that sort of scene at the end of the Keira Knightley Pride and Prejudice when Darcy walks through the mist towards her with his coat flowing behind him. There's a lot of that sort of feel to it.
In the extract we were listening to, just finally, the nature seemed important to her, which was lovely. It was very well described. How is it important to you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a way of filling the creative well, of reaching back to sort of primal freedom. I think you just have to look at writers like the Brontes and Wuthering Heights to feel that. You know, there's a reason they're classics.
Thank you. So we like to have a little chat about questions which come up in the practical writing life. And this is a great story. This is going to be a positive because lots of writers know what it's like to have trouble with agents and, publishers and, COVID. Can you imagine your book comes out the day before COVID or something? But you have had a high and let's say a low and a high scenario. How did you cope with it, basically? So can you tell us about the low point and then the high point?
Sure. So the low point was that my very first book, my YA, came out during the first lockdown. And my publisher, it doesn't have a very kind of hooky pitch to it. So I think my publisher was really counting on making the cover as beautiful as possible and having people see it in a bookshop, on a table, and going, oh, that's pretty, I'm going to pick that up and have a look. And of course, when lockdown hit, that couldn't happen. And it wasn't at all big enough to be in any of the supermarkets. So it sort of died there and then. And I saw it coming and it was heartbreaking. But I had a 3-book contract, so I still had to write the next 2 books, knowing that the entire trilogy was kind of doomed. And I didn't at the time, when it first came out, have a lot of writer friends to help me navigate that. Yeah. And I don't think I did. My mental health really took a plunge. I mean, I think everyone's mental health took a plunge during COVID, but it was very difficult to figure out what on earth I was doing and how to deal with it.
How did you do it? Like, you had to do another 2 books?
I did, yes. It was very difficult. I think I had to really cling on to why I started writing that book in the first place and the things that I wanted to get across and the characters that I really did adore, and just kind of hold on to them like, a drowning sailor on a bit on a bit of wood. So yes, I got through those 3 books and finally managed my first ever actual launch party on my 3rd book, which I shared with a writer friend who had her 2nd book coming out. And by that time, I'd kind of found my writing community, which I think is so important. Menna, for example, was incredibly kind and generous, as she was a veteran writer back then, and she knew the ups and downs of the industry really, really intimately as well. So she was a great help. I ended up parting ways with the agency that I got my first book deal with, just because my agent sort of moved on to a different agency that didn't feel like the right fit for me, and they sort of landed me with another agent who clearly was just like, about having me, which isn't great.
No.
So I sort of said, okay, thank you very much, but bye. And I did the thing that I think a lot of writers do when they feel, oh, what am I doing with my career? And panicked a bit and contacted an agent who I knew had read the first book and liked it and said, would you represent me? And they were at the time a very up-and-coming agent, very successful, and I felt like they would be great for my career. And we had a meeting and they said, yeah, absolutely, I'd love to represent you. And then 3 weeks later, they contacted me, and I was actually in America for a family reunion, and it was 6 a.m. and they sent me an email saying, can I call you, Holly? I've got something to say and I think it would be easier said on the phone. And of course, everyone knows when you get that kind of message what it means. And so I was like, yeah, sure. So it was 6 a.m. My daughter was sleeping in the bed beside me. So I locked myself in the bathroom of my hotel room and sat on the toilet. And she called and said, I'm really sorry. I just actually don't think I'm the right fit for you at all.
Oh, yeah.
And it was really devastating because I just felt very powerless.
Yeah.
And like, what is the point? I was about to be out of contract. I didn't have a great sales record behind me. Was this the end? And I remember my mum was in the adjacent hotel room and I messaged her. I was like, when you're up, can I come through? And I told her, and she kind of sat with me as I cried and said, look, I think you're a writer through and through, but if you think this is too hard, then no one would blame you if you gave up.
Yes.
And that was exactly what I needed to hear.
Yeah.
Because it was permission either way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's incredibly freeing, actually.
Yeah.
And I didn't have anything to lose. And one of the ideas I'd had was for this retelling of Six Wives of Henry VIII. And I'd originally thought of it as a YA, and that was what I'd pitched to this agent.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd been starting to think that maybe it was an adult. And I'd thought of a way to do it that really excited me. And because I had nothing to lose, the next day I started writing, and it flowed out of me. And I wrote it in 3 months.
No.
Which I have never done before and never will again, I don't think.
That's great.
It was just fueled by fear and rage. And sent it out to agents and was like, I'm going to do it properly this time. I'm going to really do my homework, take advice from other writers on the Whisper Network, which is very valuable.
Yes.
And I got multiple offers within a couple of weeks and chose my current agent. And a few months later, we got a 6-figure deal with a major publisher in the UK and the US.
That's lovely.
So it was really vindicating. And I know as much as anyone that getting big deals doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the quality of writing, although I am really proud of that book.
Yes, yeah.
But it was a nice little up yours.
Do you think, like, because as writers, we have these near-death experiences. As writers, non-writers might laugh, but it is very close. Do you think you've been improved by that experience?
Yes. I think I've been scarred by it, by all of those first sort of 3 years of being a writer. But yes, definitely come out of it with more knowledge and more nous, I would say. I don't necessarily know. I think my writing has improved purely because I have practiced writing.
Yes. Yeah.
I think that my business acumen as an author has improved.
And what's it called? What's the book called?
6 Wild Crowns.
Well, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed talking to you, Holly.
Likewise. Thank you,
fascinating stuff. And now I'm going to hand you over to Anne Morgan with all the latest RLF news.
Several new books by Royal Literary Fund Fellows have hit the shelves in recent weeks. Old Soul, the latest novel from Susan Barker, was published by Penguin and named a Guardian Book of the Week in February. Meanwhile, Miranda Miller's 9th novel, When I Was, has come out from Barbican Press, with an open invitation launch taking place at 6:30pm on Tuesday the 18th of March at the Owl Bookshop in London's Kentish Town. In poetry, Maggie Harris's latest collection, I Sing to the Greenhearts, has been published by Seren. Maggie will launch the book at Rosslyn Court Music and Performance Venue in Margate at 7:30pm on Friday the 21st of March. 2 Royal Literary Fund Fellows have been shortlisted for the prestigious Tinniswood Award for Best Audio Drama Script. Man Friday, Edson Burton's reimagining of Daniel Defoe's classic Robinson Crusoe for BBC Radio 4, drew praise from the judges for its brilliant and witty reframing of assumptions about race and class. Meanwhile, Southall Uprising, Satinder Chowan's drama based on the stories of those protesting the 1979 National Front rally in Southall, also for Radio 4, was singled out for its vividness and technical brilliance. The winner will be announced on the 30th of March. Poet Cherry Smith will join Ed Bennett's Decibel Ensemble for the world premiere of her collaboration All Earth Once Drowned at the New Music Dublin Festival next month. Cherry's spoken word piece forms part of a new commission for a 10-piece band. It is inspired by Rachel Carson's The Sea Around Us and the closing of Cherry's childhood beach in the summer of 2023 due to toxic algae. The performance will take place at the Complex in Dublin on the 4th of April at 9:30pm. As festival season gets underway, 2 Royal Literary Fund Fellows will be taking to the stage in Oxford. Claire Chambers will be discussing her latest novel, Shy Creatures, with Lucy Atkins in the chapel at Pusey House at 12 noon on Monday the 31st of March. Meanwhile, Gwyneth Lewis will be in conversation with Dr. Kate Kennedy, Director of the Oxford Centre for Life Writing, at Oxford Martin School on Tuesday the 1st of April at 6pm. The event will draw on Gwyneth's experience writing her memoir, Nightshade Mother, A Disentangling. For tickets, visit oxfordliteraryfestival.org. And now, back to the studio.
Well, Holly, we've been in cemeteries, we've been in the fantasy world, King Arthur, and it's been lovely to hear your success story, so congratulations.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFcollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.